So I spent a lot of time lately thinking about how one witnesses in a postmodern world. And all I do, I hope that I am drawing closer to the heart of Christ and that I am attracting others towards the heart of Christ. And most of my time is spent hanging around with medical students who are people in their mid-20s to mid-30s, and they're a postmodern generation. And I've had to struggle with how I relate and how I witness. And this is some of my thinking, and I'm hoping that you guys give me some more feedback, and that will all grow and develop. I think I'm just a touch on the loud side. To satisfy the CME requirements, I need some more generic and less Christian-based objectives, and we will also achieve these objectives to understand the psychological consequences of a postmodern worldview, to understand faith as a remedy to these psychological consequences, to understand how the example of a life lived well is the most attractive witness to the remedy of faith. So my project is to very briefly give you a flavor for worldview and modernity, to give you a little bit deeper knowledge of postmodernity, to go through a couple exercises that hopefully help you see what worldviews are at play in you, and also give you some insight into what worldviews may be at play in other people as you interact with them. Talk a little bit about how the psychological consequences and how one has to live if you're attempting to live postmodern, and then how the Christian life is an answer to that and how maybe we can effectively witness. Again, because this is a CMA event, I need to declare that I have no affiliations, sponsorships, honoraria, monetary support, or conflict of interest from any commercial source. I'm not talking about drugs, so this doesn't actually matter all that much, but the other thing to know is I'm still paying off my school debts and actually don't own anything. One last prolegomena slide. So every ethics talk has got to have a word that comes from Greek. This is it, prolegomena. Prolegomena are the things you say before you get to the things that you wish to say. I've been giving you some things I needed to say before I get to what I wish to say, and let me emphasize that please interrupt for clarity. If you have something more tangential, there'll be time for discussion at the end, but this again is meant to be informal. And please bear with me as the first few slides very superficially cover huge topics in the history of Western thought. Worldview. So your worldview, as you've already heard today, is in some sense your religion. Now the worldview comes from the arena of philosophy, religion comes from the arena of theology, and they probably are fairly interchangeable terms, but worldview is your answer to all the really big questions that allows you to frame your understanding of how the universe works. So where did I come from? Why are we here? Where did humanity come from? Why does humanity exist? Is there good? Is there evil? Is there beauty? Is there justice? How do we recognize them? If in the case of evil, how do we avoid it? Is there a God or gods, and what do he or it or they or she want of me, require of me? What will happen after we die? Was there anything before we were born? These are really big, big questions, and we all, whether we've thought about it or not, have some answers in our head to those questions, and then based on that, we choose to go out and live our life. Right? Because whether there's good or evil, things are right or wrong, that's fairly fundamentally important. As you go out to make choices, you're, of course, hopefully choosing what is good. So your worldview drives your behavior. Historically, and actually still in most parts of planet Earth, your worldview is constructed primarily by one's religion. So there were sacred texts, there were those who interpreted the sacred texts, and that interpretation constructed your worldview. They also told you how you ought to behave based on how the worldview was, and this was how worldview became constructed. Of course, at the same time, there was culture and family and social norms and what you were taught and wisdom and education that also informed one's worldview. And if you ever find yourself doing cross-cultural missions, one of your projects is to try to tease apart what parts of my worldview grow out of my faith and grow out of my relationship with Christ, and what parts of my worldview actually grow out of the culture I happen to grow up in and the family I grew up in. And that can be quite a project to tease that apart. Of course, as one has experiences, your worldview changes. So perhaps when you were 2 or 3, you thought that red, shiny objects were good, and touching them and playing with them was good until you touched the stove and discovered that sometimes things that are red and shiny aren't good to touch, and evil results, and your worldview changed and fed into that. And of course, your behavior then changed. Red, shiny, hot objects you chose not to touch. If we have a base personality, that plays into it. If you believe in the tabula rasa, then this octagon is vaguely offensive. Philosophy is the department in the secular university that has displaced the theologians in terms of metaphysical questions. So in most secular universities, if a theology department still exists, it's quite small and hard to find. The philosophers are fairly easy to find. And when some other part of the university has a question regarding metaphysics, they tend to move to the philosophers to provide them with an answer and not the theologians. One of the primary ways in our culture that our cultural norms and the philosophical opinions of our society are placed into our youth is the media that they consume, which is ubiquitous, which is everywhere. And also the form of the media contains some messaging that shapes worldview. So certainly media is part of what plays into this. To make it a little more complicated, things start to interact. Your behavior creates experiences. Your experiences changes your worldview changes future behavior, as we've talked about with the hot, red, shiny objects. Sometime, probably in your late teens, your worldview becomes fairly well established. You've figured out your answers to all the big questions, whether you've done so consciously or not, and you've started to live your life according to your worldview, and then the arrows flip around. So now, your worldview allows you to interpret philosophy and media and religion when you encounter it, and other cultures and knowledge, and things coming in at you are no longer changing and influencing your worldview, but your worldview is allowing you to make sense of them. And worldview becomes very insulated. So that's how worldview forms. 2 main worldviews that we contend with as Christians in Western society. The first is of modernity. So modernity is a worldview that sees the universe as a machine that exists separate from us. We can explore and learn the reality of that universe through our senses and the use of reason. Truth is out there to be discovered by us. When you discover truth, you can begin to manipulate the machine and thus solve the problems in the world. Reason and exploration lead to knowledge. Reason then uses knowledge to solve problems. All knowledge is accessible by reason and our senses, and hence all problems are ultimately solvable by us. Christianity invented science, but modernity embraced science as religion, and science as a basis for worldview. This is a classic image from modernity. What do you see here? So yes, so something atomic, right? There's a proton with some your nucleus with some protons and neutrons in it, some electrons spinning around. Is there anything else it could be? That's me at the center of the universe. So certainly in psychology, this may be you at the center of the universe. In family studies, this may be the nuclear family, parents and children in circulation. It could also be a sun and planets. Their orbits are a little bit off. But no matter what you see, what it is a mechanical system, whether it's a solar system, an atom, or a family. And if you can understand the mechanics of the system, you can then manipulate the system to solve the problems in the system, whether it's the atom, the solar system, or families. What was supposed to happen, of course, as we did all of this, is utopia would arrive. 100 years ago, it was thought, not quite 110 years ago, we were getting better and better all the time. Science was advancing, knowledge was advancing, the primitive cultures on the planet were being civilized by the more modern nations. It's a good time to be human. Until the most modern nations did the unthinkable. So in 1914, the most modern nations in the world, who were through reason and knowledge seeking to save the world, led the world into a conflict about power that killed and maimed unthinkable numbers and resolved nothing. And then probably the most modern, most cultured, most knowledgeable nation on the planet, Germany, leads us to do it all again. And this time, killing soldiers and civilians caught in the crossfire isn't sufficient. We take out 12 million more people. And we justify it by wrapping bigotry and self-centeredness in science. And we bring it about by creating some of the most brilliantly engineered killing machines that humanity has ever constructed. And of course, that all ends when a different group of scientists invent the ability to literally wipe out humanity and destroy the planet by only pressing buttons. And there's a crisis. Utopia has not arrived. Instead, we've arrived at an incredibly evil and awful place. What went wrong? What comes out of that is maybe a new worldview, maybe it's just modernity examining itself, maybe it's just a crisis of confidence, and probably is already on its way out, as you heard during the debate today. But certainly the optimism and confidence is gone. The root of all evil doesn't seem to be ignorance and lack of knowledge, but lust for power and hatred of the other. Truth seems to be just whatever those in power choose to say that it is. The solution seems to be respect for the other and limiting the power others can assert over you. In the shadow of the apocalypse, the world is a very dark and lonely place, and in some sense, postmodernity is the only rational response. So that's one way to think of these things. I'm going to take you through a slightly different way, which is to define them and then apply them to a problem relevant to my line of work, that is the question of abortion. So Christian worldview is complex, but at its core, I think, would be to see the world as Christ does. To see ourselves, to see others, to see the planet through the eyes of Christ, essentially to become Christ, so that we can do that. Modernity says, through reason, rationalism, through the use of our senses to explore the world, empiricism, we will come to all knowledge. And one of the important things that it does is classify. So if you've ever, I didn't particularly enjoy botany, I must say, but if you ever sat in botany or a first-year biology class, you got introduced to taxonomy, right? Everything needs its classification. Everything needs to be put in its box. There is a truth about what the thing is. We will decide together what the thing is, and then we will know what we ought to do to the thing or with the thing. Classify. Postmodernity says, no. All knowledge is just a construct of those in power to advance their ends. There's really nothing that can be known, and so pursue pleasure. Have a good time. There's really nothing more one can do, and there is a radical individualization. Everyone has an equal say, everyone is equally intelligent, everyone's statement about everything is equally valid, and no one can claim authority over anyone else. How would one apply this to the question of abortion? Should abortion be done? As a Christian, one would say that human life is sacred, that humans at all stages of development have inherent dignity imputed to them by God. And so I should see the fetus as Christ sees the fetus. Christ sees the fetus as a human being. All human beings are of immense value to him, so much so that he would go to the cross for them to restore relationship. Human life is sacred. If you're into modernity, the abortion question is primarily about definition. What is a fetus? What category of thing is it? Is it a human being? Is it a person? Are all human beings persons? How do we categorize this thing? And once we categorize this thing, we decide what ought to be done with things in this category. So it's a fetus. What do we do, can we do, not do with fetuses? It's a definitional problem and then a procedural problem. What do we do with this thing? Post-modernity people are vaguely confused by the question, because for them, the fetus is whatever you choose to decide that the fetus is. Right? Just as Mark is whatever I choose to decide Mark is. And if the fetus is interfering with my pleasure and my pursuit of pleasure and my success, and I have decided that the fetus has no value, then the fetus has no value. If I have decided that the fetus has tremendous value, then the fetus has tremendous value, and society ought to allocate resources to help me preserve this pregnancy which is in trouble. I get to decide the value assigned to the fetus, and of course, if I assign Mark very little value and then choose to act on that, Mark will push back. The fetus does not do so. It's a question of the fetus is whatever I say it is. So that's the truth claim that one would make. Life is sacred. The fetus is a certain thing. The fetus is whatever I say that it is. Why would then one enter into a debate? So we had a debate at lunchtime today. Why I entered into that debate and Reverend Boot entered into that debate was because together we were trying to draw towards the heart of Christ and to understand better how we draw the heart of others towards Christ. And if I'm engaged in a debate on abortion, my ultimate goal is that I may move closer to Christ and move the hearts of others closer to Christ. Now, if you're into modernity, if modernity captures the way you see the world, you enter into that debate because you must convince the other of what is true. It is true that the fetus is this class of thing. And it is true that we ought to treat this class of thing this way. And I am going to engage you in debate because it is terribly important that I convince you of this truth. In some sense, it's like Mark and I agreeing that over on the table there is a thing. And we disagree as to what that thing is. And so through reason and debate and our senses, we will move closer to understanding what that thing is. And once we can get there, then that's useful. Debate is useful. But my goal is to convince him that he is incorrect. You will find very few postmoderns are even interested in debate at all. Because if you and I disagree, there is no mechanism by which any resolution could come about, since there isn't anything on a table over there. There isn't even a table over there, and hence why even have the discussion. And you will find that, again, you can find atheists on the campus who are willing to engage in debate because they are modern, and this is terribly important to them. Most postmoderns will stand in the background and enjoy the spectacle of intellectual brilliance, but aren't all that convinced by what goes on. If they choose to enter into debate or disagreement with you, it is only for the purpose of taking you out as an obstacle to what they wish to achieve. So the only part, if you disagree with me, I'm going to probably not engage with you, but if I have to engage with you because your disagreeing is in some way interfering with my goals, my primary objective is to take you out of the equation. Right? We see this in politics. Politics becomes a blood sport. Right? It's a little bit like the arena. The only thing one can do with your opponent is take him out. One might choose to refuse to provide a termination, to provide an abortion. As a Christian, I would hope that that refusal is based on an other-centered love of the woman who is pregnant and the fetus that is living within her. Again, it's an other-centered, I cannot do this because I care too deeply for you and I care too deeply for the other human whom God values within you. For modernity, you would refuse because it's wrong. It's just wrong. Everyone should be able to see that it's wrong. It's obviously wrong that you've miscategorized this thing and you've misunderstood what can be done with this thing, and I need to convince you, but if I can't convince you, I'm still going to refuse because this is a wrong. Postmodernity, you're going to say no out of straight up self-defense. I'm not going to do this because it's going to harm me if I do. And I certainly have some colleagues who choose not to provide abortions, not because they have any moral objection, but because they don't want the protesters on their front lawn. They don't want the eggs thrown at their car. They don't want their children harassed. It's kind of icky. They don't want to do this. And so they choose not to. And that makes sense in a postmodern view. So hopefully at this point, you're getting a sense of what category you might see yourself in, and you're probably also thinking of some of your colleagues that you've had discussions with and where you might categorize them. And what you may also be realizing is that you don't fit perfectly into a particular category because certainly most of the young adults that I interact with in the medical school are an interesting mix when it comes to the human body. When they ask me the question, how does one treat gestational diabetes? They are expecting a very modern response. Well, the human machine, when it is pregnant, functions in this way. This is how you manipulate the human machine to get the better outcome. As to what the better outcome ought to be, and as soon as I put my ethics hat on, they are thoroughly postmodern. As Christians, we are continually being sanctified through the renewing of our mind. We're continually moving out of the way we have been encultured and into seeing the world as Christ does. And as we go through that process, we will be a mix. In some sense, I'm in a middle generation. I grew up in a modern church, consuming postmodern culture, and hang out with postmodern peers, and I'm trying to be a Christian in the mix. And so all of these have an influence on my life. So if one embraces postmodernity, I don't know if embrace is the right word, if one becomes postmodern in reaction to what you see around you, which is probably a better way to phrase it, there are some things that will be true. Since reality is unordered and unknowable, one lives with fear, anxiety, insecurity, and usually nihilism in one form or another. When you get up in the morning, you can't say for sure what is going to happen. There's no obtainable knowledge. You've got some things that you think are probably going to happen, but you never know for sure. And so there's always a little bit of fear and anxiety. Since history and life are meaningless, you are responsible for the meaning you create and must tolerate and coexist with other people's meaning. Right? There isn't any truth out there, but we have to have some truth in order to get out of bed in the morning, so I create truth. And I'm responsible for the truth that I create, and I'm responsible to ensure that as I interact with others, I tolerate and coexist with the truths that they have created. That's my job. Power is the route to pleasure, and pleasure is the only good. There isn't any truth, there's nothing to achieve, so eat good food, have lots of sex, and when life gets difficult, take yourself out. Since there is no authority, self-expression is limitless. There is nothing that dictates to any of us what we do or don't do, or who we aren't are, and so you can essentially do anything that other people around you permit you to do, and if they're not permitting you to do what you want to do, probably the first thing you need to do is find a way to take them out so you can do what you wish to do. Since all truth is constructed by groups motivated by self-interest, skepticism and cynicism become instinctive. If every time you interact with someone, you're thinking, what are they trying to gain? What are they trying to get from me? How are they trying to exert power over me? And you've grown up thinking that way, skepticism becomes something you're probably not even conscious of anymore. You just automatically suspect because that keeps you safe. So how do we get out of this? I mean, this is not a very nice place to be. When you think about it, it's a fairly lonely, desolate place. Even when you're involved in romantic relationships, you're always thinking, what's the other person getting? Is this a fair deal? Am I extracting as much pleasure from this as my partner is? It's all sort of business and commercial and transactional and pretty lonely. The way out, of course, is to drop that idol, that religion that postmodernity is, and embrace the truth, which is that God created the universe, and God loves and cares about you, and you need to surrender your life to Him, and in that you will find all of the things that postmodernity denies you. And what we're going to do in a couple moments after I talk about how worldviews change is redo that list I just gave you from a biblical point of view. So some of you might be thinking, I desperately want to help others move from a postmodern worldview to Christ. But you told me at the beginning that worldview is a pretty insular thing. That worldview is pretty hard to change. You know, I don't work in the nursery. I'm not forming worldviews. I'm working in university, or I do adult education. How is it possible to ever change? What happens is that your worldview is driving your choices. You're behaving according to your worldview, but worldview is also helping you interpret experiences. So you have an experience, you make sense of the experience based on your worldview. And this all works very well, except when one has an experience that your worldview cannot explain, that you cannot make sense of. Now, when that happens, you've got two choices. Either you need to reinterpret the experience you have had so that it is consistent with your worldview, or your worldview needs to change. The contemplation that your worldview needs to change is increasingly disturbing as one gets older and older, because if you contemplate that your worldview needs to change, you are also contemplating that every single decision you have ever made in your life was based on a lie and is incorrect. And if you're 5 and haven't made very many decisions, that's not a big deal. If you're 50, you've made an awful lot of decisions that could all be totally incorrect. So when you start to poke at somebody's worldview, don't be surprised if they have a bit of an emotional reaction, because you really are asking them to contemplate something quite disconcerting. What we're talking about here is an experience gap. Something happens that you cannot explain. And when that happens, either your worldview changes or you have to reinterpret the experience. So one of the things I certainly recommend to Christians, if there are areas where you think, I think my thinking and my behavior in that area is modern or postmodern, then find experiences which force you to rely on Christ and his way of seeing things. Seek experience gaps. Go into the developing world, work with the homeless. Whatever thing you're attached to, if you think in your worldview, I have to have a certain degree of wealth and power to be happy, that's not biblical. I need to break myself of that. Go somewhere where you have no wealth or power and have to serve others. I think we can choose to look for experience gaps that change how we see the world. And if you're not sure where to go with that, then that's a great thing to take to Christ. Christ, my worldview is not what it is. I need to think more like you. There is still idolatry in my life. Lead me. It's a dangerous request. But lead me to places where you shake up what I believe. As we are a witness to others, we need to be the experience gap. We need to be something they can't make sense of. One of the great stories of conversion of someone who is modern would be C.S. Lewis, who grew up an atheist, and in his worldview, Christians were in the category of people who weren't very smart. Because obviously if you were smart and had explored the world, you understood through reason that the world was a machine without God's involvement, that God either did not exist or was not in any way involved. And so the only way that one could be a Christian is to not have applied reason and not be very bright. So he had his box, right? Christian goes in this box. One of the characteristics of that box was not very intelligent. Then he finds himself in a grad seminar. And the 3 smartest men around this small table were all Christians, right? He couldn't put them in the box anymore. His categorization was breaking down. They were Christians, but one thing that was true of all Christians was that they weren't very intelligent. So he's got a problem. Either he has to reclassify them, well, maybe they're not Christians. Maybe. So he starts watching their lives. Maybe they're not actually all that intelligent. Maybe they just fake it well. And as he spends lots and lots of time with these men, he discovers that he can't do either of those two things. And his worldview begins to fall apart, and through a long series of things, he reaches a point where he says, reason dictates that God exists and God is involved and that I must surrender to him. And he describes that he was the most miserable person in England on the evening that he came to that realization. His worldview, based on reason, he had reached a conclusion, and his emotional reaction to that was disaster, calamity. Everything I've done to this point in my life may have been entirely incorrect. And he has that emotional reaction. Those 3 men were experience gaps. Now, when you become an experience gap for somebody, don't expect them to thank you. They won't like you for having done that. What you'll get is an initial, fairly negative emotional reaction, but if you've done it well, they will then start to watch. Either they dismiss you entirely and stop thinking about you entirely and just block that part out of their brain, or they've got to watch you a lot more carefully so they can do this reconciliation. So what might it look like to be an experience gap? Well, let's contrast our list from before with how this list might be constructed if you have a Christian worldview. Since reality is ordered and known perfectly by Christ, one surrenders to him and finds peace, joy, and security despite circumstance. So a Christian in the life of a postmodern who has peace, joy, and security, despite what is going on in their life, doesn't make any sense. And you can expect this person to say, how on earth can you not be worried about X? And if anyone's had that question asked of them. Right? Which leads one to say, well, because reality is ordered and known perfectly by Christ, and my life is surrendered to him and he's in charge. And hence all of these things that you need to worry about, I don't. Since history and life are God's story, you are only responsible for obeying his leading. Love God and love your neighbor without thought of gain. It takes a lot of pressure off. God's in charge. He knows what he's doing. He can accommodate. My task is to love God and love my neighbor. And I'm doing that simply because God has asked me to, not because I gain anything. Other-centered, self-sacrificial love makes no sense in a postmodern world. You will be something they cannot accommodate, cannot explain. Two examples that Margaret would want me to share because she thought that they were very good. One is a great piece I remember reading after the death of Mother Teresa. Right? Mother Teresa makes no sense from a postmodern point of view. So this very postmodern reporter was trying to figure her out. And he concluded the following. He said, well, Mother Teresa believed that she had an eternal soul, that there was a little bit of life and then she had all of eternity. She also believed that those that do the best in eternity are the saints. Right? The saints seem to have the best life after death. She also believed that the way one became a saint was to sacrifice and give one's life. Therefore, obviously, her life choices were driven by her selfishness and her need to achieve sainthood. Isn't it too bad that she was mistaken about eternity and thus wasted her life? Right? He's accommodated. He's made sense of her according to his worldview. I also have a nurse that I work with all the time who is probably a mix of modern and postmodern, but she's continually trying to figure me out, trying to figure out my angle. What am I gaining by this? You seem to be making all these sacrificial choices for others. What are you getting out of it? And she's a few times said, oh, I see, other people treat you better when you treat them well. Ah, I see your game. And that sort of breaks down. We've been through this series of her trying to figure out my strategy. Why am I behaving the way I'm behaving? It doesn't make any sense. Pursuit of power and pleasure are abandoned to pursue Christ, who is the only good. So if people see you having an opportunity to take power, if people see you having an opportunity to pursue pleasure, and you simply walk away from it to serve Christ, that will make no sense. Since Christ has all authority, all expression should point to him. So certainly when we interact with others in debate or in helping, we should as often as possible try to take the attention from ourselves back to Christ. And our lives should be marked by love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, the fruits of the Spirit. And if your life is marked like that, you will be an experience gap. And that experience gap will be a witness to this person that something about how they view the world is wrong, and the Holy Spirit can use that to draw them towards Christ. That's all the prepared stuff that I had, and I've heard this a few times now, so that was all a little boring for me. The more interesting thing is to engage with you. Unfortunately, you can't read those. They're a little bit too dark. I have a website, www.danreilly.ca. This will be there, as the whole conference will, and a whole bunch of other stuff I've done is there. So that's a place to hear more from me if that's what you desire. And then dreilly@mcmaster.ca is my website. It's not my website, my email. So if we don't get to your question here, if your question occurs to you 5 days from now, which happens to me all the time, I think of brilliant questions days later, or is a little embarrassing, then you can email me. And that could well be. So the point is made that worldview is so what I would say is that worldview is a philosophical way of trying to categorize people, and hence is modern, which is of limited utility. totally agree. I have found it helpful in understanding the characteristics of some what I see in the medical students that I interact with, but of limited help. Again, it's helpful in the way that culture is sometimes helpful. Oh, you're British. Well, that helps me understand you a little bit, but not very much, because there's many different ways of being British. So worldview, or you're Buddhist, or you're Muslim. Oh, I think I have some understanding of you now. Let me double check those understandings against who you really are. And then there's a whole lot of depth that I can't get to by understanding those sort of one-word descriptors. So, yeah, point well taken. Yeah. So the question is, have I, when interacting with a medical student, through a knowledge of worldview, been able to make clearer for them their presuppositions? I would say yes, in the context of Christian medical students. Because I only get 4 weeks with non-Christian medical students, and I certainly live a Christian life. But even 4 weeks isn't long enough for someone potentially to get into those questions. And also, it's a learner-preceptor environment, right? And so certainly you can say to a friend, I think you're a complete buffoon. I mean, how can you believe any of this? Right? You probably won't say that to a preceptor. I think I'm a fairly friendly preceptor, but all the same, you probably won't say to me, this is idiocy what you think, right? But certainly when I'm with Christian medical students and we can get into those things, I have been able at some points to say, well, again, you think this way. Is this what Scripture teaches is how we should think? Let's go look at Scripture together, right? And so again, hopefully I'm not saying, you think this way, you fool. I'm saying, you think this way. I'm not so sure that that's consistent with Scripture. Let's go look at that together. Right? And always coming back to that. Yeah, so that would be the answer to the question. Yep. So he's saying is that he encountered a salesman who was saying, well, I think you should buy this out of a sense of enlightened self-interest. Right? Because again, in a postmodern context, the only way that we can relate is if we both stand, the only point in relating is if we both stand to gain. Right? So, and of course sales, this makes perfect sense. So in a sales relationship, the salesman knocks on your door, it's immediately apparent what he stands to gain, your money, right? And so what he has to do is convince you that actually you stand to gain just as much. What's really sad, and some people think that late modernity or post-modernity is actually just the final working out of commercializing and capitalism applied to everything. So I meet a young woman and she's beautiful and we start to enter into a romantic relationship. I'm thinking, I stand to gain this and this. I'm going to give her in return this and this, and I'm going to be carefully monitoring to make sure that I'm getting as much out of it as I'm giving. All right? And of course, we all know that love, not self-sacrificial and 100% dedicated to the other, is never true love, which actually is what we're all hardwired to want. We all want true love. Right? We all want God's love, that sort of complete commitment to the other. We're hardwired, our hearts are restless, right? Until we rest in God. And so you end up pursuing relationship, but always with that sort of commercial transaction in place. And of course, there's nothing wrong with pornography as long as it's not pirated. Has everyone been appropriately compensated? Is everybody happy with how they've been appropriately compensated? Well, then there's no evil here. Yes, the contracts get longer and longer. Same thing in the doctor's office. You come in, I want something from you. I'm very glad that the state is willing to pay the price for you to give it to me. So yet, even in the doctor's office, we all, in some sense, want a physician who cares deeply about us and will sacrifice for us, but suspect that that's not the case. Which I think maybe drives a lot of the conspiracy theory around doctors are in it for the money, and unfortunately, if you're postmodern in how you view your relations to others, even though you're very modern and that's why you do medicine, That is actually how you'll interact with patients. They asked too much of me. I couldn't give that much. How dare patients require that of me, right? Only one question per visit. That's all we can accommodate. That's all the government's paying me for, right? And don't mess with the balance here. And of course, in sales, you make this unspoken thing you make verbal so you can get past it to continue in your sales pitch. Yeah. And in some romantic relationships, it's made verbal. Yeah. Great. I think with that, I will conclude, since there's a banquet and a jazz concert coming up. But I'm happy to hang out here for a few more minutes while other people have other things to ask.